Ladies and gentlemen, please start taking your seats. We're about to start. So we have a complete panel. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. This is Sandra Farid, your MC for today, for the Finance Day. Our next panel is a very interesting one, talking about the role of platforms. The panel will be moderated by Dr. Celine Hawaii, Group Chief Sustainability Officer at HSBC Group. I will let her introduce the panelists. Again, the title of the panel is Trillion Transition, Harnessing the Potential of SDG-Aligned Investment in Emerging Markets. Here you go, the mic is yours.
Thanks very much, and hello everyone. I'm delighted to welcome our distinguished panel. As the header shows, our focus is really on going from the billions to the trillions today. We really want to go deep on how to unlock the obstacles. We know nowhere near the amount the need is flowing at the moment, especially so to emerging and developing markets. With me today, I've got His Excellency Dr. Mohammed Maïd, Minister of Finance in Egypt. We have Akin Schneider, UNDP Administrator, Alexia Latortu, who is the Assistant Secretary for International Development and Trade at US Treasury. We have Faith Ward here next to me, who's the CEO of Institutional Investors Group on climate change. We have Ronald Weister, CEO of APG Asset Management and on the board of APG Group, so a large Dutch pension provider and asset manager. And we have Kurt Morijsen, Head of ESG Advisory at Legal General Investment Management. So as you can see, we've got a brilliant group of public and private sector players who really are at the heart with their institutions of being able to unlock the type of funds that we need. Just to set the scene, you probably hear a whole load of numbers on what we need, but the UN have published a report saying 120 trillion needed over the next 3 decades just to transition across industries and geographies to net zero. And that about 70 to 80% of that needs to come from the private sector. Now those numbers that I just quoted don't include adaptation finance. Nick Stern put out a great report yesterday that had another set of numbers. And of the 120 trillion, we know about 50 to 60% of that needs to go to flow to emerging markets and developing markets, just again for the net zero transition. That's taking out adaptation, which is on top of that again. If we look at what's happening today, and just take renewables, for example, we've had 2.8 trillion invested in renewables globally in the last 20 years, and only 2% of that went to Africa. So we're really not where we need to be. Let's be clear that we can't get to net zero and we can't get to a safe, resilient future without unleashing transition finance at this kind of scale over the next decade and then ramping up even more over the decades to come. So, His Excellency, I'll start with you, if you don't mind, as the host here. Egypt has a very successful track record with investors at the continental level. ranking first in Africa almost in terms of attracting foreign investment. We've had great successes in solar and wind financing, energy policy reforms. And obviously, in September, you launched your Nwembe program, which has water, food, energy at its heart, and it's a bottom-up program, investment program that helps Egypt meet its climate objectives. But tell us more about where you are in terms of attracting the scale of finance that Egypt really needs to get to net zero and a resilient future.
Thank you very much for the introduction and this very important question. Let me say that Egypt has made a very good story with regard to energy and in particular renewables. This country 6 years ago used to have electricity only for 12 hours maximum a day, and the rest of the day you have no electricity in the whole of this country. 6 years ago, we started the strategy, and the Ministry of Electricity published its energy strategy, which they started to implement it. This strategy is a combination of traditional way of generating energy to renewables. Over the 6 years, we were able to overcome significantly our energy shortage to a country now is exporting energy. Is a country which has a surplus, and 20% of this energy generating is from renewables. We built the second or the third largest solar generating station in the world in the south of Egypt, in Benban, which fully financed by private sector. Not only that, we started to be the leader in hydrogen, green hydrogen, green ammonia. And with the strategy we published, it's moving very fast, which will enable Egypt, number one, to be a leader in green energy, and number two is to be an exporter of green energy to Europe. And with that, the country succeeded to diversify its sources of energy. We have stations generating electricity from wind, solar, from gas, from nuclear. We are building 4. So we have this diversification which enabled us. But let me say that relying heavily on the private sector to help Egypt to implement its energy strategy and to move gradually to replace the current ones with renewables, which we are moving. And yesterday we signed with Norwegian the hydrogen, which started the first stage of production in the economic Suez Canal area. It's something promising, which says that by 2030 we may be able to go to a higher percentage of energy based on renewables and green energy. So this is the story of the country of Egypt with regard to, let me say that without private sector, without the multilateral development banks and other countries, Germany, France, and others who supported us, and I believe this wouldn't be possible because it's huge investment and still looking for more investment. As you've mentioned, WAFI with the energy sector is taking the core at the projects which we are aiming, and yesterday we have seen signing of billions of dollars of projects in this direction. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Mr. Minister. Alexia, I may actually go over to you next in terms of talking about the kinds of projects that Dr. Mohammed spoke about, big, large-scale hydrogen infrastructure projects. They'll be very long-term. They'll be, quite expensive projects for commercial banks, the private sector to take on because of the cost of capital. So how do you actually crowd in that foreign capital? I know that you've been doing a lot in Treasury in terms of, Secretary Yellen, yourself, and others, in terms of what's the evolution of the MDBs in so that we can move from a business model that's very much focused on the world where we need to unlock billions to a world where we need to unlock trillions for challenges like climate.
Thank you so much, Celine, for that question. It's something that is very important to me because we have to remember that the MDBs were created in a very different world where we were asking them to finance projects in one country and to focus on their own financing. And all of a sudden, we're telling them, actually, given the enormity of the global challenges that we have, climate change being step number one, really, your own financing will never do the trick. And so you need to actually reorient what you do to not only finance projects yourself, but to be able to crowd in the private sector. And in our view, there is a 4-point evolution agenda that's really critical to that. The first one is for the MDBs to really socialize the fact that today, their shareholders are asking them to absolutely keep doing work on poverty reduction, on achieving the SDGs, we still have a long way to go, and tackling global challenges like climate as an explicit part of our mandate and as a mutually reinforcing goal, these three things. So once the vision is clear, number two, they need to think about the incentives for countries to come, countries like Egypt, to come to development banks to borrow for global challenges like climate. And I want to stress that we're shifting from a world where the cost of a project and the benefits of the project accrue to the same project. If we're talking about tackling climate change, sometimes the cost is in a country, but the benefit will be for the region or for the world. And in those cases, it seems appropriate for the global community to help pay part of the cost. And so when we think about incentives for countries to borrow from the NDBs, we need to open up more concessionality, including for middle-income countries. Now, caution, this is not the door super wide open because it's not needed for all investments. So, for example, solar now is quite competitive, cost competitive in many markets. But if you're trying to decommission coal, you'll need, deep concessionality. And so we need to develop, and the NDBs need to develop, a framework for thinking about concessionality for certain investments in the climate area. The third thing that we think is really important is looking at the operating model of the development banks to make them fit for purpose to address global challenges like climate. So, for example, we think they should be able to do more at the supranational level. They should be also able to do more at the sovereign level, including without a sovereign guarantee. The role of cities can be quite important in tackling some of the climate challenges. And then very importantly, and very directly to your question, Celine, is they need to sort of reorient their operating model to really understand that part of their mandate is to crowd in the private sector. And so we've talked a lot about blended finance all week. That is part of the equation, but I would think blended finance not just at the project level, but thinking about structures or platforms that could be regionally based or subject theme based. But we also need to develop more de-risking instruments. And I think we use guarantees already, but I think we can sort of think about more sophisticated types of guarantees, insurance, reinsurance as well, really important. Bond issuances for sure is another place. And I know people don't always want to talk about this, but the policy piece is really critical too, right? Tackling the policy environment to unlock opportunities for the private sector. And then the fourth part of the MDB evolution agenda is the financing capacity. If we're going to do 1, 2, and 3, you said it in your opening, Celine, we need way more scale in the system. And so it means that the MDBs need to stretch their balance sheets to the maximum responsibly. Because we need scale today, but we need scale 5 years from now, and we need scale if, unfortunately, another shock happens. So this is an agenda that we and many of the shareholders have spoken particularly with the World Bank about. We started with the World Bank, we'll go out to all the developed banks, and we've asked them to come back to us with a clear roadmap of how they will address these 4 points, because this is not about talking, this is about changes, organizational changes, to get results in the near term for countries.
I mean, it's really good to hear that. I'm sitting here as a big global bank at HSBC, and we're doing exactly the same thing. We're redesigning our operating model so we can finance this stuff. So, the fact that the MDs need to go and do the same thing makes perfect sense. And over to you, I know, in terms of your MVP, jumping around a bit. When it comes to faith, I'll give you my microphone, that's easier. So, you obviously you do a lot of country programs, you do kind of funds, regional. Private sector, we've got a goal around 1 trillion in unlocking at the UNDP level. So maybe just tell me a bit about where you are on this journey.
Well, let me begin with the 1 trillion, because I think with the latest figures also that Lord Nicholas Stern and Songway presented yesterday here, we're obviously sometimes at risk of projecting to the public out there that we are talking in a kind of Netherlands realm of investments. But I think sometimes the data when you aggregate is that you lose sight of the terrain in which you're actually moving. I mean, the fact of the matter is 1 to 2 trillion is roughly 1% to 2% of our current global wealth. I mean, we estimate global wealth at around 430 trillion. So if you put it in that context, first of all, the order of magnitude we are discussing here about redirecting or incentivizing to invest in problem solving for something that's existential becomes far less ominous as an absolute. Secondly, people think that this is all taxpayers' money. And I think we've already heard here that we are talking about a financial economy, about a global marketplace, a global economy, in which you're trying to essentially attract capital from investing. And that should be always remembered. A lot of this money is already being invested, but it's being invested in yesterday's technology, energy infrastructure, carbon-intensive infrastructure. It's not about printing more money, it's about redirecting, re-incentivizing this money. So, very quickly to pivot to UNDP, one reason why we have become so much more engaged in the issue of finance and financing of development and therefore of climate change is very simple. We work in 170 countries. The countries we serve are looking for partners who can, without necessarily being a lender to them, help them think through what their options are. Much of what we do today is to do the de-risking that enters into domain policy that enables a country like Egypt to develop scenarios on how to mobilize capital investment for renewables, for transitions, for different forms of land use and agriculture production, and therefore make, if you want, downstream of where investors usually look at the global marketplace, a country much more interesting. It also brings down the cost of borrowing because risk is viewed differently. At the other end of the spectrum, we decided to invest in something that ESG was not really delivered in the market. That is a greater degree of transparency and accountability when it comes to impact. SDG impact, that's the term that we use in UNDP, is today a set of norms that we have developed very closely with many stakeholders, including the financial sector, that allows countries now to develop bond instruments with which to go to capital markets. And we have had remarkable uptake of this, over $7-8 billion just in the first 12 months in the Development Bank, in Mexico and Uzbekistan, with Uruguay, with whom we've cooperated. And what we're trying to, in a sense, add here is the capacity of a development agency to speak more clearly to the accountability, transparency, and measurability of impact. Because, as we have also seen with the Secretary General, we just announced a report that is trying to counter also this fear of greenwashing that has entered much of the private finance arena as well. So that, as a development agency, is sort of a spectrum in which we are trying to help create the conditions in which money that today is invested over here, carbon-intensive, fossil fuel, large-scale, centralized generating infrastructure, into decarbonized, decentralized, off-grid, or indeed regional integration of power grids that allow a transition to the kind of levels that you have spoken to, Minister, to happen in many more countries. And I think this is why we should not be scared of this notion of trillions, because trillions are already being transacted in our energy system every year. Thank you.
Thanks, Zachary. I'm going to go over to more of a private sector view now. And I'm working out who to start with. Maybe Faisal, we've got the microphone now, so we'll start with you. So you're CEO of the Institutional Investors Group of Climate. Chair. Apologies, yeah, chair. And that group represents, is it now 50 trillion of assets under management? That's the latest, probably growing.
Yeah, about 62 trillion, and over 375 members representing sort of a European sort of asset body, including HSBC, Algin, and APG, all members. So our role is to accelerate that transition, to really enable those. My day job is to be one of those investors as well. So I'm actually a sort of capital allocator when I'm not representing IGCC at COPs.
So as I guess as an organisation, we'll come to these with the individual kind of asset managers next. But what are the kind of systems changes that are that you're kind of putting with that collective in place now to try and unlock these trillions? And as part of that, obviously, naturally money tends to flow more easily to the north and the west and less easily to the south and east. So as part of that, also the net zero commitments, is there any also focus on making sure we're unlocking capital to where it's most needed as well?
No, absolutely. I mean, we know, and you started in your sort of introductory remarks, I mean, the level of capital that's needed. We need to triple the amount just in renewables in the next 10 years. And we know that the amount of money going into emerging economies is a fifth of what it needs to be. So there's a massive gap there. And I suppose the way that we're sort of seeing this is, I suppose, to really leverage the points you've already made, this is an investment opportunity. So we operate in investment in a very sort of risk-oriented way, but kind of pivot that to the investment opportunity set. And so one of the ways in which IGCC aims to do that, initiated the Net Zero Investor Framework, which is the most used framework for the investor community setting their net zero commitments. And that requires the setting of a climate solutions target as well as decarbonisation. And I would argue that actually almost that's more important because the solutions is that flow of capital, particularly to developing economies that can really kind of sort of revolutionise and really accelerate that transition that we want to make. And investors are making it. Last year at COP, I made announcements about you had asset owners allocating up to 70% of their AUM to these kind of solution areas, but it's not enough, either speed or quantum. And some of that, there are policy constraints. We need governments that they can really help to kind of accelerate the speed of the deployment. And one of the areas is the global investor statement to the governments on the climate crisis, which sets out some of the kind of asks that will really help in terms of sort of setting not only the ambitious NDCs, but really integrating that into policy commitments so we can see the plans. One of the things I think has made a real difference was the commitments we had around electric vehicles, the rollout of that, and just clarity around that sector decarbonisation pathway. We need similar sort of transition plans for those hard to abate sectors, and also regional pathways, as you say, country pathways. What is the what are the plans for the developing economies, so we can get behind those and put that money to work. So this is really important, as you see, quite a massive gap. And I think the commitment, the passion to do that is there. It's just a piece of sort of having that nice supportive policy environment.
Thanks very much, Vic. I think within HSBC we have an asset management arm, and I'm going to go over to Kurt next as an asset manager from LGIM. But I know that when we did the analysis, we estimated that about 50% of net flows for asset management are going to be linked to the transition by 2030. So it's just business, right? It's like you have to be in that market. Plus, obviously, that's an area that all the LPs want engagement around. So there's a huge amount of innovation happening in the sector to be able to fund this. So it'd be great to hear a bit from you. Scott.
Checking here. Thanks. It's a great question, but a lot of the things I'm hearing at the COP, and a lot of my comments resonates with I think that Alexis is about building an ecosystem for foreign investments. But how do you do that? I look at three things. The first one, the role of international organizations, public sector, in designing meaningful strategic policies, frameworks, regulatory reforms to create a bedrock for business in countries. So technical assistance, blended finance, Switzerland. You can have the best policy in a country, but if you don't have business aligned with the ESG factors, UN SDG factors, and we can say ESG as a risk mitigation tool, and in fact it is, or impactful business, we're just half the way. I can have a great policies, but I also have to work in training and helping private sector, local private sector, and building their capabilities, ESG integration, impact integration. There are phenomenal business models in Africa, Latin America, South Asia, and we could label them impact business. And the only reason I believe they are not part of it is just missing a small component. Integrating those KPIs, measurability, adaptability as faithless. So if we build these two cornerstones, for the investment perspective, probably Ronald would be with me here. It is having innovative investment vehicles. I hear a lot at the COP, transition, but also adaptation, resilience, mitigation. Not all countries are in the process of transition. Others, we have to look at financing adaptation in infrastructure or resilience. This means that investment vehicles have to adapt to the needs of countries and vice versa. In this sense, in quick words, what do we actually need in investment vehicles? I look at the urgency of impact investing, guidelines or principles for bonds. A lot of the investments in infrastructure in emerging markets will deliver great value for clients. Equity is fine, businesses are fine, but there is a huge gap in infrastructure. When you look at the bond business, only 15% of the green bonds are issued for emerging markets. And of those, 60% are in China. Huge opportunity. I stop here just saying, emerging markets don't lack ideas, don't lack projects, innovation, they lack finance. And with a good investments, good investment vehicles, then we can allocate not only 1 trillion or 2 trillions, but we just business as usual. Thank you.
That's good. And this is still working, yeah? So last but not least, of course, so it'd be great to hear from you in terms of where you're thinking about this from a pension fund perspective.
Is the mic? Yeah, the microphone is working. Yeah. Thank you. I think that I could answer the question about what we could do in the defensive mode, but yes, I would like to talk about solutions. Think about innovation, be forward thinking and not defensive. But it is important to understand some context. The context of a pension fund investor is, of course, to be aware of a fiduciary duty, be aware of the necessity to create good return in a moderate risk, responsible risk attitude way, and yes, to take into account sustainability. That needs a less forward-looking approach, maybe, and that is the bad thing about it, because if you are return-oriented, and if you are looking for sustainability and you are looking for proof, you find a couple of blocking factors to invest in emerging markets, developing countries. And I think the way to remove those, and I agree, it already happens.
Well, I think you have to hold your mic a bit more up. I was here an earlier panel. This does the trick. Tip it up.
So I should hold my hand up higher, not the microphone. That solves the mystery. I was raising the microphone. It was the hand. Okay. So green bonds issuance helps a lot, and actually you get access to many investors. And in a way, it's an easy solution. So we very much would encourage it and recognize the importance of it. But we should not stop there, and we should try to work on removing the blocking factors. And to remove, I think, the big gap that is out there between private investors and development banks, governments, And how can we do that? What are private investors looking for? Many things, and I think blocking factors that we could remove. One is it scalable? Are the investments scalable? And I think an easy solution is if you are able to combine many small investors, they become big and put those in an investment structure, it becomes bigger. Flexibility is one thing. Can you as an investor sort of select the projects, the loans, the activities, the infrastructure that you want to invest in and have a certain influence? And I don't mean operational influence as such, but a way to determine whether something works or not. Do you have certain controls in place? And I think that can be solved in a way by putting in a strong operator in between. Then transparency. I think we need a certain amount of transparency. Sometimes things are a bit hidden, and of course we need to adhere to certain standards to be able to defend that we invest in something. Then liquidity. For an investor, liquidity, and we are long-term investors, and many of our asset owners, clients, our pension funds are long-term investors, but there needs to be an end to an investment somewhere. It could be 30 years, that long period, but there needs to be an idea around an end to the investment. And risk sharing, I think that's an important way to share responsibility and to bridge the gap. If governments are able to come up with first loss assurance, or at least go invest, I think it is a lot easier to be able to invest, go aside these government organizations or the government themselves investments. We are trying to remove those 5 blocking factors. An example of that is the ILX platform that we have established. That is finding a way to bridge it. Our client, our pension fund client, ABP, has invested 750 million. That's not trillions, I admit, but it is a good start and a good contribution in private loan investments that are used. The organization, the platform, bridges the gap between us as asset owner investors and the projects out there that are handled by development banks and governments. And that's important that somebody bridges that.
Well, I'm gonna come in here so we can get another round of questions in. We have about 10, 15 minutes.
But I thought, well, my microphone is working, I need to repair it. I hear you, thank you.
Good stuff. What I'm hoping to do on this next round is focus a little bit about barriers, but not just leave on a downer. Also, we've got great plans. If you've got a barrier that is key barriers for you that someone on this panel you think can help with, and please direct your barrier or your solution or your ask to others on this panel as well. So maybe you have something to ask Alexia for the Excellency, or the US Treasury might go. I won't guess who has something to ask from others, but I would like to focus a bit on barriers here in terms of what we really need to overcome, especially in the next 6 months and next year. So I will start maybe with you, Dr. Mohammed, if you would mind. Need a microphone. Maybe not that one. Okay.
If I got your question right, the barriers for accessing finance or for...
Yeah, so barriers to unlock to get the scale of finance you need, and also there's anyone on this panel in their organizations.
Okay, let us look at the figures which published everywhere that for us, in order to reach the SDGs by 2030, this world is annually in shortage of $3.7 trillion US dollars. Africa alone is $1.3 trillion. We found that only 5% of all the green financing or financing climate change is coming to Africa. With the current situation of low accessibility, high debt, high cost of financing, high inflation, and war, and all of that, all of these are barriers. Barriers for financing, barriers for moving with climate change, this one. Second one, as we were discussing this morning, we need more, let me say, putting the standards for, the standard for sustainability, standard for green financing. We're still, struggling with what we should do in order to be able to access green financing, whether green bond, whether green loans, whether private sector. We still need a lot of, upgrading skills, knowledge transfer, and building the capacity to be able to access successfully green financing. So a lot of barriers, for some of them might be for the time being, and we'll check later, as we said. Some of others need very constructive roadmap in order to ensure that we will be able easily to achieve and access green financing. Let me say that I will take the case of Egypt. Egypt target for mitigation and adaptation for the climate change is about $250 billion. 200 for mitigation measures and $50 billion for adaptation. For us to attain $250 billion for the current situation is huge burden. And if we say that, okay, let us NDBs and let us private sector and let us others, can we get affordable financing from NDBs? Can we get affordable financing from the international financial markets? Yes, we are trying with the private sector. Private sector can, NDBs, yes, but we are calling on them, please increase your capital, please offer more concessional lending, particularly for developing countries and in Africa. When, as I said this morning, Christina said, we should have green premium. I said, we need to remove the opposite, which is Africa premium. So green premium, I understood as it is indicated, lower cost. What is happening now for our African continent? No, we have additional premium because we are at this. So again, we need to work collectively to ensure that these barriers will be eased, gradually removed, and will enable us, particularly developing countries, particularly African countries, will be able to have affordable finance, and also the idea of this swap, which we were talking about it in the previous session, is important, with all other measures like partial or full guarantee from NDBs and insurance. All of these ideas can help to ease the barriers for moving forward with climate change commitments. Thank you.
Thanks, Minister. A whole basket of barriers and solutions there as well. So, Alexia, over to you. And maybe, I think, just given time, if we can kind of choose one kind of silver bullet or big area each, that would be great.
Uh-oh.
I'm
not sure I have a silver bullet. Can I just first really praise both Admin for reminding us that we're also trying to just redirect funding. So, like, if you think about all the net zero commitments in Glasgow, right? So it's not just to move funding away from something, but towards something. And that brings us to Faith's point about the opportunity. And we need to stop thinking about climate action as a cost only, but also as an opportunity. So I just really wanted to lift up those points. So I had an ask of everybody in this room, not just the panelists, which is we need to be more specific and nuanced. And I don't think you were being defensive at all, Roland, because the reality is, private flows are moving away from emerging markets, right? Thank you, Minister, are moving away from emerging markets. So when we talk about the trillions moving into emerging markets, we're never going to get anywhere, in my view. We need to say, what markets are you actually able to go in? And then for tomorrow, 6 months, you said, it's not going to be every market in the world. It's probably going to be, on some continents, unfortunately, a handful of countries. And then which sectors? And then for that subset, be super ambitious and deliver. Right? And talk to the MDBs, talk to the others, what do you need, and then have higher ambition on a smaller subset. And then you grow over time. But if we stay in these generalities, there's no accountability possible, and we'll be having the same conversation a year from now. So I just urge everybody in this room, more specificity, more nuance. Okay, can I just say two more things very quickly? So then I think we need and you, Egypt, have shown this. We need political leadership, we need political will, and we need political follow-through. So all the plans that we have, the NDCs, the LTSs, the national adaptation plans, they're fine, they're good, they're important. But they need to be translated into investment strategies. So again, that we get into the specificity to create the link between global, national, sectorial ambition and the real projects that we can then finance. So that's, a plea that I would have. Again, you showed the results with your story of transition into renewables. The other thing I would say is that you really need we need collectively research and development, right? So we saw what happened with solar and wind that are quite competitive now. We need to now figure out the hard to abate sectors, cement, aluminum, steel. We need technologies that are not yet invented to be able to facilitate the transition. That's why I'm really proud in the United States that passed the Inflation Reduction Act. We're gonna really give certainty and clarity to the private sector that they can make the large-scale investments needed to develop the technologies that we need to facilitate this transition.
Thanks very much. I think definitely the Inflation Reduction Act is the envy of the world right now. It's such a brilliant sea change in terms of the ability to now go and invest in those new economy areas. Akib, over to you. And again, silver bullet is one word because there is none, but what would you like to focus on from this slide?
Very telegraphically where Alexa left off, obviously as the development program of the United Nations, our focus will always be on ensuring that no one is left behind. So can we help those countries that will not be on the highway of international finance? Maybe the ones that are not in the group of 4 that you mentioned just now, or 6, how can we help them to at least have better terms of access to financing? I mean, it is a progression and it is one that we have to ensure, because otherwise we're going to leave. If you take the African continent, this is where 2 billion people will live. Just imagine for a moment an electricity generating infrastructure of the 1980s and 1990s being replicated on the African continent. This is more people coming onto the grid in Africa in the next 30 to 40 years than China has actually had to deal with when it had to do electrification. So there is both a developmental rationale, there is also global climate change rationale to actually figuring that out. One example, if I just conclude that it's a reverse example, many small savers can make up a big pot of money. What we also learn in Africa is it's very difficult to start having any commercial around scheme where you sell individual photovoltaic panels to people who can't even afford to maybe pay for the education and school books of their children. So what do, you aggregate essentially a business model, and it's been done in Africa already. Kenya and other countries are leading on that, where somebody actually invests in buying the panels, installs them, and has a pay-as-you-go charging system. Boom, you've brought the many small savers of a pension fund together. They are able to invest at a scale that is attractive. You've solved the problem that, poor people cannot invest in capital, but they do use a few cents a day to buy electricity so their children can actually study in the evening. And you solve 2 problems at once, and you've created a market in which suddenly all these arguments that were used for 10, 50 years, why this will never work, are just gone. We need more creative business models, we need more smart regulatory frameworks, and suddenly markets open up, including for countries that traditionally we know the financial world is very risk averse, is very often quite conservative, and will not touch with a barge pole. I mean, I'm using this deliberately as an argument. We can change that. And that is where the kind of panel that we have assembled here is precisely sort of alliance that is needed. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Akib. I might quickly hop to Ronald and then over to Faith. Remind me the mic. You got one, Ronald. Okay, perfect. So yeah, the Ronald's next. So that you can finish where we are in terms of either one. I think either one of you, the private sector view, maybe something innovative that you're looking for, where you see the peer group doing that is that is trying to shift this now in terms of shifting your own business model to scale up more in this space.
I'll be short here. I would like to underline the point that yes, we are open, and the political will, the point that election needs to be there. And that's not only true for developing countries, it's also true, I think, for developed countries that often governments don't like to see private investment there because they ask for certain things. And I realize you want to have control of your own infrastructure, control of certain things that you want to do, but there's many ways to solve that. And I think sometimes we also see the political will missing, and we can talk a lot, but then it's not going to happen. So that's the only thing I would like to.
I had one thing. There is an interesting quote, African proverb that said, you can walk fast alone, but you can walk further together. What Akin is saying is fantastic. We're speaking the same language. There would be no one investor or two or one country or one DFI, one MDB or UNDP or UNCDF alone that would solve this issue. There is a universe to invest. It's much more the convenient power, the catalytic power of the UN is critical. And that's an example we have here today. We have the UN Treasury, amazing association of the IGCCC, an asset owner, a massive asset manager of almost $2 trillion, and we're together because of the UN. So that's the real power. And of course, the Egyptian government.
And on that note, I'll let Faith wrap up a little bit from a systems perspective with the IGCCC.
No, thank you. And I think I'll just build really, and I totally agree with all of those points. I think we just all need to be courageous, all in our own areas, but I think some of that courage can be built by continuing this communication and just keep talking to each other. Because we do sometimes talk past each other, and I think we just need, and then we just make so much progress, I think, by having those conversations and those reinforced by having, as you say, those depth plans. So we need to have that sort of that granularity, so we can really, we can get behind. So I think there is that spirit that we want to be investing this money, we want to accelerate that transition, and it is about that cooperation and being courageous together. And we do need to do that and not wait till COP28 to have another one of these conversations. Let's just keep that dialogue going every week. We just got to keep it going. So communicate and collaborate. I think good words.
Thanks, Faith. You've done a brilliant job of helping wrap up for me. I think the main thing is we have to do things structurally differently now moving forward. We have to work together, and we need some structural changes, structural reforms of the MDBs, the way DFIs work, of the big commercial banks. We have to redesign ourselves. We have to look at our own risk appetite for this. We have to look at carve-outs of balance sheet. We have to engage with the prudential regulators on capital treatment so we can do more of this stuff at scale. We have to be working, with our Egyptian colleagues on looking at the investment pipeline, what we can invest in, how we can bring in the DFIs, how we can work with the UN and others on pipeline, how we can work with our asset management colleagues to invest in. So it's one ecosystem. Finance is an ecosystem. And we need some structural changes, but there's a brilliant opportunity, and I think we know what we need to do. We need to get on with it. So thank you very much, panelists, and thanks for everyone for joining.